Hello all, welcome again. Dr. JC here, week three. Week three, crazy, going fast. As the old military saw goes, stay alert, baby, stay alive. Yes. And this week we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into various aspects and events that occur in British colonial America. And while I'll apologize for it being a little hackneyed because it's going to be kind of thematic, we're going to be applying various historical lenses. For example, a political lens, social, cultural, spiritual type lenses to look at some salient events that take place between this French and Indian War and as we approach this American Revolutionary period. So let's jump into this week's content right now. I want to start briefly here with a political lens and look specifically at governance in British colonial America. Now, I know in last week's lecture I made brief mention of these charters when we talked about the peopling of British North America, right? Each colony had a different type of charter. Well, I wanted to go a little bit more in depth here and make mention of the fact that there were different forms of charters. There were generally three different types of charters: a more general charter, a proprietary one, and a royal one. And while the nature of British colonial rule would vary by the nature of the charter, it's important to understand that, by and large, any charter here in British North America was offered by the king and society organized and governed by the directions, law, and intent of the king. Put another way and simply, despite the different types of charters, direct rule of Britain's American colonies was in the hands of the British king and eventually the British Parliament, as a way to ensure that British colonies were organized and run in direction of the Parliament of the King. Royal governors were put into place in each of the colonies. And the vast majority of these royal governors were handpicked by the king. They were yes men and bobbleheads of sorts. Yet despite all this British oversight, it's important to understand that each colony had its own colonial legislature that was representative in nature, that property-holding men could elect folks to represent them within their colonial legislatures. And thus, if you look at this on balance for the day, for the time, this is really pretty progressive as it relates to rule. Yes, there are colonial royal governors and there's the king and parliament, but American colonists can largely govern and tax themselves. And while, yes, they have to present any new policies to the royal governors, and then the royal governors have to send that along to London for ultimate approval before it becomes law, Americans really do largely have the ability to organize society as they see best and fit. Pretty lenient system, really. Well, at least until 1763, when the British king issues that proclamation of 1763. And a couple years removed from that, as we'll talk about in weeks ahead, Parliament will pass this Stamp Act in 1765. It begins to look like the British Crown and Parliament all of a sudden. After over 100 years of allowing Americans to govern and tax themselves, all of the sudden is going to start to insert itself, enforce itself, inject itself in all aspects of American society. And this is going to piss off a lot of colonial Americans. Again, we'll talk more about that as we move forward. To move on from colonial governance and into some other aspects and elements and key events of the British colonial period, this period leading up to the American Revolution, I want to start here with these systems of deference. Deference in many ways really was a public act. It was a way to recognize the social systems or structures of the day, which essentially held that some people were better than others. Some families were better than others. And if you happen to come into contact with one of these quote-unquote betters in a public way, then you were expected to show due deference or respect. An example of that would be, let's say I were walking down the street. I'm from a lesser family name than a gentleman that is approaching me. I would be expected to step off the sidewalk, take off my hat, and bow to that gentleman as he passed. Another concrete example from the period, I'll use John Adams here. When John Adams was at Harvard, he had a really good buddy by the name of Jonathan Sewell. Now, Jonathan Sewell's family was just known to be a better family than John Adams. Well, Adams worked his tail off, scored better in most all subjects than Jonathan Sewell. And when it came time to graduate, John Adams was ranked below Jonathan Sewell. So think about that for a minute. Imagine you working your tail off, outperforming most all, if not all, your peers, but then being ranked below them once it came time to graduate simply because you're from a quote-unquote lesser family. So you can almost understand how this really irritated John Adams. And Adams and many other Americans will start to begin to question the value of this type of system. But we're going to promote people based on family name rather than hard work, talent, and merit? This needs to be addressed. We'll talk more about John Adams and his role in the revolution moving forward. Beyond the social systems associated with deference here, I'd like to bring in spirituality or religion too. Spirituality or religion was a central component to most all people in British colonial America. Most people did go to Sunday or Wednesday worship, as it were. Churches were at the center of town. Now they will be replaced by the courthouse, but at least early on, the church was at the center of communities, which says something, yes? Yet while the church may have been central to most all communities, it didn't mean that people worshiped the same. Clearly, there were different Christian religious denominations, many of those emanating from this European Protestant Reformation, where the Catholic Church and its practices were called into question by folks like Martin Luther, and it led to the creation of several different Christian Protestant denominations: Anglican, Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, all Christian, but all with their own unique practices, doctrines, and dogmas. And in colonial America, there was this merging of social deference with the spiritual world as well. That some faiths were perhaps better suited or associated with the wealthy or elite of society, Anglican, Episcopalian, whereas others would be for those lesser people, Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists. And the elite churches generally were along the eastern seaboard, along the coast. In the back country, the up country, the frontier, that's where we generally saw the quote-unquote lesser peoples and lesser churches. And in a way, the geography and spirituality and social deference kind of makes sense. Let's go back to indentured servitude. We'll use colonial Virginia. Where are the wealthy elite going to establish themselves? Places along the coast, Jamestown, Williamsburg, so on and so forth. But as those individuals serve out their indenture, those lesser people that couldn't pay for their way to come across, right? Where are they moving? West, to the frontier or up country. And these are individuals that don't necessarily like the wealthy or elite, right? So they're going to gravitate to spiritual faiths or systems that are more democratic in orientation than they are aristocratic or hierarchical. You see where this is going? A little class difference is beginning to emerge between those that settle along the coast and those in the backcountry. Keep that in mind, because we'll come back to that throughout this course. Now, before we pivot into a couple salient events and talk about the institution of slavery as well, I'd be entirely remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about what I meant about more democratic in orientation, these frontier religious denominations. The established churches along the coast, the Anglicans, Episcopalians, and others, generally were led by a preacher who went to divinity school. Their services tended to be a little bit more programmatic. People sat in the church according to class and station. Those with the better family names, you got to sit in the front pew. Those with the lesser names, you got to stand in the back, or maybe you got to listen from outside the window. Along the frontier, however, churches were led by itinerant preachers. These were individuals that didn't necessarily go to divinity school, but they could just preach, baby. I mean, these were like the Franklin Grahams or Joel Osteens of our day. People that could really move others through the power of words and speech. Especially during these revivals, everyone was invited. Women, free blacks, all elements of society. And that's what you see along the backcountry is a more democratic experience. I mean, people can come together of all different color, gender, and creed to worship together in a kind of informal way. Whereas along the coast, much more rigid. I don't want to use the word ritualistic, but more rigid and in keeping with the social systems of deference. As we begin to run into the last few minutes of the lecture here, I want to talk about a couple of events that might best illustrate or articulate these differences, not just between red, white, and black in colonial America, but social class differences between those along the frontier and those established along the eastern seaboard. And I want to start with this first major event that takes place. It's a slave uprising in South Carolina. Well, there would be other previous slave uprisings in British North America, and I'll touch on a few of those here in a minute to include the reason why this one's so impactful and important. You have to understand that this Stono Rebellion, led by a slave, a literate slave by the name of Jemmy or Cato, happened to be the largest slave uprising in British colonial North America. Now, this is before American independence, but it is the largest. While I won't get into the details of this rebellion, I'd encourage all of you to do a little research on it because it is so impactful. I want to talk more specifically here about the impact of it. Understand this, you're in South Carolina. We talked about the peopling of British North America, and that in South Carolina, plantation owners from the Caribbean were brought in to start a plantation economy based on what? Slave labor. Understand the black to white ratio in South Carolina, especially along the coast, approaches 8 and in some cases 9 enslaved peoples to 1 free white person. Therefore, the greatest fear amongst white people, especially plantation owners, is this very thing, rebellion. And white folks aren't armed with automatic weapons. If masses of enslaved folks decide to rise up and charge, you're gonna lose. Therefore, control is essential. Before we get into the impact of the Stono Rebellion, I had mentioned that this was hardly the first slave insurrection, and I want to talk about a few of them here. Most specifically, the one that happened in 1712 in New York. This uprising that takes place in 1712 in New York, and I'd ask you guys to research that too if you're interested, had an impact up and down the colonies. Beyond the discussion it caused in New York. Remember, this is a society that has as much free labor as it does slave labor. And if slave labor is going to become this much of a problem, perhaps we need to go ahead and start to sell this property and problem south. But also in places like South Carolina in 1712, folks in South Carolina can start to question and say, look, if uprisings can occur in societies where the white population is much larger than the enslaved black population, imagine what could happen here. And as a result of that, slave codes were tightened. Yet in the wake of the Stono Rebellion, 1739, you'll notice on this slide that the South Carolina slave codes were expanded in 1740. Changes took place. Why? Because of the Stono Rebellion. While codes will be updated and in some cases new codes be written, such as making it illegal to teach your slaves to read and write, even for Christian purposes. Why? Jemmy was literate. Understand too that limits are placed on the amount of corrective action, whether it be through words or the whip, that slaveholders can apply to their slave property. No longer will you be able to indiscriminately go ahead and correct your labor force if it causes them perhaps to rise up, and in the process of rising up, sweep into the hurricane of violence and rebellion other white plantation owners that don't treat their slaves that way. And thus the Stono Rebellion casts into the public sphere a discussion about the treatment of one's property in the South. More of that to come. Now in the last minute we have here, I want to talk about these Virginia slave codes in 1705, and I apologize that we're kind of walking backward chronologically here. As mentioned on the slide here, not only did these codes in Virginia in 1705 allow for legal trade of slaves, the codes were written in such a way as to start to segregate white and black society. Question is why? The answer, Bacon's Rebellion. Bacon's Rebellion, led by Nathaniel Bacon in the years of 1675 and 1676, proved to be the most powerful insurrection against established authority in the history of the colonies. Think about that for a minute. Now, this isn't necessarily a slave uprising. This is an uprising against British rule. Bacon's from the frontier, and he has with him a coalition of white folks and black folks that together march on established authority along the eastern seaboard. The 1705 codes, therefore, were meant to separate whites and blacks so this didn't happen again. More on this in lectures ahead.